Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I will be discussing the history of what I call the first book jitters. This will be an examination and assessment of many different authors' first mystery novel and comparing it to their entire body of work. I always looked at the first mystery novels as sort of like the first pancake on the griddle. It's totally fine and edible, but it's not really like the stellar product future pancakes will be. It's not as if these books are bad. I don't think many of these books are the best of the author's work, nor are they really the worst. There are varied degrees of quality, which I'll get into. Now, there are other terms for this phenomenon. TV Tropes calls it early installment weirdness because the canon hasn't been settled yet and the author hasn't firmly established where they want their books to go. I selected these 12 authors for a few reasons. I've either covered them on the channel, they have a large body of work I'm familiar with, or they're simply just very important to the genre. Any authors left out isn't a slight against them, but I cannot include every mystery writer ever. I will not be spoiling any book specifically, although I may allude to vague events within books. Before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with this channel. And I'll start off with who else? The Four Queens of Crime, and beginning with the big one, Agatha Christie and her first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, which features Hercule Poirot. And this is such a good book to begin the discussion. Styles feels different from your typical Christie novel. It almost feels like a Sherlock Holmes-esque novel with, the heavy presence of physical evidence and pretty standard Holmesian deductions. It's very Holmes-esque. Christie would slowly move away from this in favor of the more psychologically heavy elements. Not that this book lacks those either, but it's not the main focus. Poirot investigates ashes and stains on rugs. I mean, we don't see him do a lot of that moving forward, even just a couple of books later. Christie wrote 66 novels, and they vary widely, but Styles is really the only one that does like the physical evidence in such a heavy handed manner. Styles is narrated by Hastings. We have a first person narration that Christie would also largely abandon for most of her works in the future. She did use it from time to time, but this is heavily influenced by the Sherlock Holmes stories. Christie said she let go of Hastings because she felt Poirot no longer needed that sidekick. He was strong enough to stand on his own, and we can feel that in future books. Poirot doesn't rely on Hastings to gather information or misinterpret it, as the case would be. Styles features a courtroom scene, which is something we get very little of in future Christie's. And I think for me, the most important aspect of this book in terms of this video's discussion is its influence on future Christie's. Christie uses her trick ending from this book many times in the future, and she does it better in all of those other books. You can really see Christie's skills advancing as time progresses. If you read this book and then read something like Death on the Nile or Evil Under the Sun or Murder at the Vicarage, all three of those books are essentially rewrites of The Mysterious Affair at Styles, just done better. Now, I think of Styles as sort of like a middle of the road Christie that probably gets some bump from being the first, but it's so different from most Christie novels, but it also provides the future foundation for many of her works. Let's move on to the second queen of crime on the scene, chronologically, that is, Dorothy L. Sayers and her first novel, Whose Body? And again, Whose Body is just very different from her total body of work. I think the most important thing to note here is that I've always found this book disorganized. I don't think it's written too well. Now, I wouldn't say it's poorly written, but it's just not smooth. Lots of bouncing around, no smooth transitions, characters come in and out without any real introduction to them. It's not always clear to me what's going on in any given scene until like a few pages into it. The solution, it works. It's overly complex and not totally convincing. Lord Peter Wimsey is very different in this book, very over the top. He would calm down quite a bit, even by like the second novel, Clouds of Witness. He was a bit of a caricature in this one before he would become into his own being as a series character in his own right. He was just kind of dumb even in Whose Body. Like there are moments where he just like doesn't comprehend basic things. This is immediately dispensed with. Again, folks, it's the first book jitters. Whose Body is very little like other whimsy novels once Sayers perfected her craft and decided where she was going and how she could improve her literature. Like Styles, I find Whose Body, middle of the road whimsy. It's not awful, but it's not top tier either. The third Queen of Crime, chronologically, is Marjorie Allingham, and her first novel, The Crime at Black Dudley, featured Albert Campion in a supporting role. The main character is George Abershaw, who, quite frankly, isn't that interesting. I don't believe we ever see him again. Now, Campion is more or less himself, although we don't really learn too much about him until the next book, Mystery Mile. Campion wasn't supposed to be the main character in Sayers' works, so already, like right off the bat, different feel to Crime at Black Dudley. It actually feels different from even like those late Campions where he is again delegated to supporting character status. Black Dudley is mostly a parlor game mystery, a very classic style we don't see much of beyond like the 1930s. It does contain elements of like that professional criminal adventure thriller Campion would star in. And I would say of all the Queens of Crime, Allingham's first novel is probably most like her body of works, if you take out Campion's supporting status. But again, I have this rank in the middle of Campion's novels. It's average. Allingham had not yet perfected her craft here, and you can easily see that. Our final queen of crime is Nio Marsh, and her first novel, very similar stuff to Allingham, honestly, is A Man Lay Dead. And this one too has a different main character in Nigel Bathgate, with Inspector Allen delegated to supporting character, something that was changed again for the second novel, Enter a Murderer. And only Marsh kept Bathgate around for a little bit longer, and A Man Lay Dead is another parlor game mystery, the only one Marsh wrote, and also only one of two country house mysteries she wrote. It's a different style than Marsh's typical novel. It also features a lot of red herrings involving like Russian communists, and Marsh would later move away from that, even though, other authors did not. Now, in comparison to the other queens, Marsh doesn't like rearrange her characters' personalities in the future. They remain very consistent. But here, even again in this book, no Inspector Fox. This is the only book he does not appear in. Or at least even mentioned in there, when Alan is in New Zealand, he does write to Fox, making a cameo appearance there. No Agatha Troy. We do actually get Bailey and Thompson, who don't really get much page time moving forward, other than their presence being there. But you can still see how A Man Lay Dead was written before Marsh really took hold of her craft. Marsh is known for her unusual murder methods, but she always made them seem real and workable. And A Man Lay Dead solution does not seem real or workable. It contains that odd feature of the mechanics, but I mean, this one simply doesn't work as well as they would in future novels. Marsh herself was very open about this and how she grew not to like this book because she felt like it wasn't up to her standard, and it's not. Out of the four first novels from the Queens of Crime, A Man Lay Dead is easily the worst. I mean, it's one of the worst Roderick Allen novels. I have it ranked, I think, second to last. Now, I don't think it's like a terrible product, but Marsh certainly would do much better in almost every other novel she wrote, and certainly planned more believable, smoother murders. Moving on to what I like to call the Yankee Triumvirate, a trio of New York City based male amateur sleuths who have very similar styles and their books have very similar atmospheres. The chronologically first of these is Philo Vance and the Benson murder case. I know a lot of critics consider this book the best Philo Vance. I certainly think it's one of the best, but not the best. I mean, this is a rare example where I think the first novel is in the top tier. But the Benson murder case still feels very different from the larger body of works from S.S. Van Dyne, although in a different way than most. The Benson murder case is extremely basic. There are no frills or creative murder plots as we see in later Vance novels. The plot is extremely basic and simple to follow. In later books, the murder plots get more convoluted, less believable. The back half of these books really fumble the ball quite frequently. Now, I don't think it's as bad as most people claim, but it's still very pronounced. And the characters don't really change that much. This was Van Dyne's MO in that he was very formulaic. It's heavy on the investigation. So I think plot wise, the Benson murder case fits in, quality wise, but it's different in that is better than most, which is odd. Usually the first book isn't better than most, and there's a unique reason for that. After the first few Vance books came out, the Queens of Crime were in full swing across the pond and in America, and there was a lot of interest in those mysteries and in their styles. And those of books like from S.S. Van Dyne just weren't tracking the attention, and he would try to like emulate that style while remaining hard and fast to his 20 rules, and they just did not work most of the time. And you can even see, like, in the Benson murder case, it's very like stripped bare. It's too much murder investigation. I know that's like a weird thing to say, but that is the case here. Ellery Queen is essentially a mimic of Philo Vance, especially in investigative styles. His first book was The Roman Hat Mystery, which is probably like the one exception to my the first book is never the worst rule. Although, to be fair, much of this comes from the fact that, this book is filled with overtly racist content and is extremely pervasive throughout. It's really bad. But even like putting that aside and looking at the mystery and the style, the Roman Hat Mystery is in line with Queens of Crime's first books. The mystery, while intriguing, has a lot of plot holes in it. There's withheld information, and we just don't get that in future Queen novels, especially once the nationality titles pass. But even like in those later ones, we still don't have this. Style wise, Roman Hat Mystery is like a Philo Vance novel, very heavy on police tactics and investigation, lack of characterization. It's very much a stickler for Van Dyne's rules, but the cousins quickly move away from that and begin writing, Christie-esque books where the murder is solved via character clues and psychology and far less on like the police investigation. Ellery's father, the inspector, takes a back seat and Ellery becomes the main sleuth. Something often ignored and not really like realized nowadays about amateur sleuths is that their strength in crime solving is that they can do things the police cannot. In the Roman Hat Mystery, Ellery works in lockstep with his father, the police inspector, but in most other novels, he works independently and doesn't follow police procedurals and standard practice, even if he might be with his father during that initial, chapters. But because he doesn't have to, Ellery doesn't have to follow like search warrants, and he can ask embarrassing probing questions to his friends or whoever, and he can still learn that information. It's not the police inspector where he has to be careful because, the evidence can get thrown out in court, and that's so evident across the Ellery Queen canon. The final member of this triumvirate is Nero Wolf, created by Rex Stout. And his first novel is Fair de Lance. And I've always found Nero Wolf difficult to assess in this regard because Rex Stout was notoriously cavalier with continuity. He just didn't care about that. So there are a lot of like minor inconsistencies, but the characters are largely the same from book to book. They aren't as developed as they would be in future novels, but that's, basically a given. Fair de Lance, I've always had mixed feelings for. I've recognized it as a classic of the genre and a very influential book at that, but personally, I've never loved Fair de Lance. I think it starts off pretty slow, and the plot is a bit ridiculous. But definitely like one of those murder plans you expect from the Golden Age. It's one of those ones that like you should be willing to suspend your belief in reality for this. And I think future Nero Wolf novels are more grounded and more consistent with the characters and the plot. I also think most other Nero Wolf novels are just better, even if they aren't as iconic as this one. I'll say there probably are less consistencies with Fair de Lance when compared to the rest of the canon than there are with other authors' first novels compared to their later books, but it's still present here. Let's move on to some British male authors. Why aren't they called the kings of crime? I don't know, but maybe I can coin that phrase here. And let's start off with someone I haven't talked a lot about on this channel, believe it or not. Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes and his first novel, A Study in Scarlet. This is another book that I just never cared for. I think the other three Holmes novels and most of the short stories are just vastly superior to A Study in Scarlet. And I'll say this novel establishes Holmes and Watson's characters in a way that they never really alter too much in future appearances. We get the introduction to Holmesian investigative method, but here I think it's a bit sloppy. In future novels, it's very smooth, but I feel like Holmes jumps to a lot of conclusions in A Study in Scarlet. There are some gaps in knowledge, and then you have like that whole like weird Mormon thing that's really bad and really inaccurate portrayal of Mormons, but that's not really a factor for me in this video, although it would be on a ranking. And there are some small inconsistencies later works contradict. It's not like anything major, so it's not too pronounced, but the main difference is the quality of works, with Doyle clearly improving over time. Moving on to Anthony Barkley Cox's first novel, The Leighton Court Mystery, which features Roger Sheringham. The Leighton Court Mystery does everything you would expect an Anthony Barkley mystery to do. He's experimenting with storytelling and murder mechanics, but it feels very stripped bare of its bells and whistles. The plot is not as complex as most other Barkley novels, including the later Sheringham's and the standalones. Noticeably, we are away from the suspects for much of this novel, and this is something we also see in like the Witchford poisoning case and like the very, very early Barkley novels. We don't have Inspector Moresby like we normally would. Instead, we have Alexander Grierson for the first two books before Barkley establishes his regular canon. The Leighton Court Mystery is a great book, but it's not special. It lacks the more complex plots his other novels have. It doesn't do anything wrong, but it feels very basic. It's as if Barkley was intentionally holding back and saving like his best stuff for the future. Now, I don't think that's what he was doing, but it's certainly what it feels like. Another writer I haven't talked about too much, if at all, on this channel is Freeman Willis Croft and his first novel, The Cask, another book considered iconic in the genre. And the most notable difference for me is that this book does not feature Inspector French, who is the main sleuth in I think every other mystery novel Crofts wrote, except maybe like one or two others. The Cask is another that isn't like too different from the majority of his works. It feels different because French isn't in it. The plot of the cask was actually reused in a later Inspector French novel. I almost didn't talk about this book because it's not part of like the author's main series of books, which makes comparisons a little more difficult. But I did feel like it needed attention, and the cask is certainly one of like the best first novels from a mystery writer. But other than that, I just don't have a lot to say about it for the purposes of this video. Another great example of the first book jitters comes from Edmund Chrisman's first Gervais Fenn novel, The Case of the Gilded Fly, which is a decent book, but like, wow, does this book need some work? And Chrisman's writing dramatically improves over time, even just like the next book or two later. Gilded Fly has a fun mystery, but it's written in a way that just a slog. It's difficult to get through, despite its good plot. Crispin does a lot of work like hammering out the plot and the mechanics that it becomes just too much and never like lets the plot speak for itself. It's too focused on getting everything right that the entertainment value lacks considerably. Much of the action takes place at Oxford, both the town and the school, and like boy does this feel like sitting through some like boring university class. And Crispin does so much better in all of his other novels. I mean, this feels like the work of an author striving perfection without actually knowing how to get there and before he has like a long way to go to reach that perfected status. And I'll finish this video off with Mary Roberts Reinhardt and her first novel, The Circular Staircase. And Reinhardt isn't as well remembered today as other authors are, but she was on the scene early in like 1906, I believe, and before the Queens of Crime, but she was like insanely famous in her time, like more famous than Agatha Christie was. And this is another tough assessment because she didn't have like a series long detective character. I believe all of her mysteries are standalones. The Circular Staircase is her most famous novel, and I would probably rank it like relatively high on a list of her books, which, to be fair, I have not read all of her mystery novels, but The Circular Staircase does suffer from the first book jitters. There are a number of small intertwined plots that like come together, for the most part at the end. The solution to the main mystery kind of comes out of left field. I don't want to say it's not solvable because I think it is, but there aren't like any like real clues to get you there. The heroine of the book just sort of like stumbles across the solution by chance. Future Reinhardt novels would be smoother and better constructed. I don't think I'd hold them in as like high esteem as The Circular Staircase, but again, you can see the author fine tuning her craft as time goes by. And that is it for this video. I hope I succeed in describing the history of the first book jitters to you in such a way that you can understand what I'm talking about and can see this in these authors' works. When you go back and read like an author's first novel after you've read their whole series, it's a little jarring. It can be sometimes. And I wish I could cover more authors in this way, but 12 is enough for one video. I don't want to get too lengthy. Next week, since March is Women's History Month in the United States, what better way to celebrate that than with the Queens of Crime? And I will be having a Queen of Crime Battle Royale where I will compare the four Queens of Crime in various aspects of mystery writing to see who comes out on top. Make sure you vote in my poll to select the next author's works I will rank. Rex Stout's Nero Wolf is currently in the lead, but Edmund Chrisman and Josephine Tay are both gaining ground. So until next time, Mystery Files.